If we were the type to put our stock in conspiracy theories, then we'd have blamed Conrad for the COVID-19 pandemic long ago. Human life expectancy has increased drastically over the last couple of centuries thanks to borderline miraculous advancements in medical science. Before that, every century was capable of falling prey to a dark age, and it did, in fact, because pestilence and plague were common beyond the Middle Ages. The crowned rider of the White Horse of Pestilence, or Conquest, however you interpret it, decided at some point in his life that a woodlouse is more appropriate for his final form, and that's how we imagine Conrad was created by Kentaro Miura. The most silent member of the God Hand is also perhaps the most lethal, as Conrad had a major hand in ensuring that Griffith's incarnation went smoothly. He has the least amount of dialogue despite being a part of the primary group of antagonists in Berserk, and that automatically makes him the most interesting for us. So, without further ado, this is Conrad's origins, explored. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. He is inspired by a Hugo Award-winning novel, Roger Zelazny's This Immortal and its ties to Berserk. Apart from Void and Femto, whose names are based on their roles in the story as the fifth element of the Godai school of philosophy and being the chosen one amongst a trillion lives, every member of the God Hand derives their naming from a famous science fiction or fantasy novel. It's clear that Kentaro Miura was a big fan of sci-fi and fantasy, because many of the concepts he uses in Berserk are refined representations of real-life schools of philosophy, which he has adapted to match the tone of his story. Conrad, in particular, is named after a character whose story was so compelling that it tied with Frank Herbert's Dune in 1966 for the Hugo Award. Roger Zelazny's This Immortal, aka And Call Me Conrad, is a tale of the human spirit surviving through unimaginable torment just because it can. Following a nuclear war, Earth's human population has been reduced to a measly 4 million people. For context, that is just under the 2023 population count for the country of Kuwait, which stands at around 4.3 million people. So out of the 200 plus countries that exist on Earth, imagine only Kuwait surviving a nuclear war that gave rise to mutated beings who have now replaced humans as the apex predators of this land. This is the world in which Conrad Nomikos finds himself escorting a traveler from a far-off planet whose people have subjugated the Earth. The Vegans, blue-skinned aliens originating from the Vega star system, treat Earth more like a vacation and tourist spot than an actual fief. This intergalactic race of conquerors saw the opportune moment and subjugated humanity only to turn their planet into an amusement park for their people. The story of This Immortal follows Conrad escorting a visiting Vegan through planet Earth, whilst protecting his life from the vengeance of mankind. He finds himself in a unique position where he is forced to defend his sworn enemy from the people who could and should be his friends, and this is the conflict that forms the beating heart of Roger Zelazny's masterpiece. But that isn't the extent of this story's brilliance. A key feature of Zelazny's story is the fact that the protagonist is some kind of demigod or higher spiritual being who is being forced to conform to the life of a human, and Conrad is no exception. He looks a lot like Two-Face, with half his face being called beautiful while the other half is labeled terrible. In the story, his wife calls him a Kalakantzaros, which is basically a goblin from folklore, but others compare him to the Greek god Pan. Roger Zelazny himself referred to that second viewpoint as one of the primary ways in which the protagonist could be interpreted, the other being Conrad's current state was thanks to mutation triggered by the nuclear war. He has lived far too long and fought far too many monsters to be called human anymore, and yet he's perhaps more human than the entire Vegan resistance force combined. Towards the end of the story, it's revealed that Conrad had been doing more to oppose the Vegans than anybody realized. While he protected the dignitary he was escorting from armed militia and his own past lover, he was also making moves to show their alien conquerors the indomitable spirit of mankind. Conrad was destroying important human monuments like the pyramids and recording the process of destruction so that even if they could see those marvels being made and unmade over and over again, the Vegans would not be able to experience their majesty in person. The Vegan dignitary was so moved by Conrad's human spirit that he ended up appointing him the ruler of Earth at the end of the tale. And while this is a heroic story that cannot possibly be related to the evil God Hand, hand, there is one sliver of connection that is perhaps the source of Miura's character, and that is the mutated beasts wandering Earth. These unnatural beings were a consequence of humanity messing about and finding out just how far Mother Nature's vengeance could go, but they are also representative of corruption, and this is not dissimilar to how plague victims were treated in the Middle Ages. Anyone who contracted the plague was treated more like a monster than man, and their lives were immediately on the line because of their condition. We think Miura's main inspiration from this tale was threefold. The first was the name itself, the second were the mutated beings, and the third was the reason why they became mutants in the first place. If we take these three aspects and transfer them over to Berserk's story, an interesting picture emerges, which is what we're going to start analyzing now. He's introduced as the Quiet One of the God Hand, Conrad's first appearance in Berserk. If you're going to follow this timeline properly, then Conrad's first appearance was technically in chapter 75, but you know how we do things here on Marvelous Videos, and so we're going to begin with Conrad's actual debut appearance first. He makes his presence felt alongside the rest of the God Hand in the prequel chapter titled Guardian Angels of Desire, Part 4, and it is apparent from the beginning that Conrad is more of a hype guy and a line filler than the main lead in their act. As the Count's blood flows into his behelit, the Interstice descends upon his castle, and Guts finally gets what he has wanted for 2 years, an encounter with Griffith. As Void begins the speech which marks the beginning of the Count's second reincarnation as an apostle, Guts only has eyes for Femto, whom he chews out for his superiority despite being battered to near death. Conrad is just as impressed as Slan and Ubik are with the Black Swordsman's tenacity, but the first time we hear him speak is not even an actual line of dialogue. Void beckons the Count to make a sacrifice and fulfill his heart's desire, and he chooses Guts as a means of killing 2 birds with 1 stone. When the God Hand members explain that that isn't how this works, he beseeches them to destroy him not as a sacrifice, but as an enemy of demon kind. This draws out a malevolent laugh from Conrad, as Ubik explains that while apostles might be similar to the God Hand, they were still beneath them on the pecking order. And so, the lost lives of a few inconsequential servants meant nothing to them. As all this is happening, Guts manages to miraculously get up and walk towards Femto sporting multiple fatal injuries, which once again draws praise from Slan and Ubik. The latter explains that it is only hatred that keeps Guts propped on his feet, hatred towards the God Hand and Femto in particular, who after all was responsible for branding him. Conrad then poses the rhetorical question of how long can he keep this up, knowing full well the answer was not long enough. Guts heroically powers through the mind-numbing pain of the brand of sacrifice and swings Dragonslayer at Femto, being knocked back by the God Hand at the last possible moment. It is this display of inhuman tenacity that makes Slan so enamored with Guts that she wants him to become an apostle, but Conrad points out that he hasn't been ordained by the laws of causality, and so it couldn't be. He also explains to the Count that he can't sacrifice Guts for the invocation of doom because he was already marked as a sacrifice, and besides, he wasn't a tether for the Count's humanity. That would be Teresia, as Femto and Ubik so eloquently explain to us later on. After Femto shows the Count where he will end up if he doesn't offer Teresia as a sacrifice, aka the Abyss, Conrad beckons him to give her up. Just one simple phrase, "I offer you my daughter for sacrifice. That's all you have to say," says the literal demon whose back looks like an oversized woodlouse. But once it becomes clear that the Count is not going to sacrifice his daughter like he did his wife, the God Hand begins to depart. Conrad doesn't even look back to see what transpires between Guts and Griffith. That's how cold he is in his first appearance. But you can now understand why we called him a sort of hype man and a line filler. He's definitely the quietest God Hand member after Void, who only speaks when he deems it necessary. Conrad only utters a sound when he finds something hilariously preposterous, or when he needs to speed things along the way. This is why, in his next appearance, he makes a bigger impact with fewer lines of dialogue. The Razor of Griffith's Reincarnation Altar, Conrad's role in the Fifth Eclipse and the Incarnation Ceremony. Conrad is glimpsed briefly in chapter 49 when Griffith gets his first canonical glimpse of the God Hand. Lying in his cell, utterly broken by torture and the loss of his dream, the only thing sustaining the fallen Falcon is Guts when he sees a brick fall out of his cell wall. From that hole, he glimpses the visages of the 4 members of the God Hand, who tell him they will wait to meet him at that time, in that place. He is the blessed king of longing, and they are his kinsmen. This idea is reinforced hard when the God Hand actually appears during Griffith's eclipse. Conrad's manifestation is perhaps the most disturbing of them all, because he makes use of the unsettling environment in the best possible way. And trust us when we say that is not good for anyone's heart. The landscape of the interstice for Griffith's eclipse was covered entirely in faces twisted by torture, land, sea, and sky. From the midst of the sea of tormented faces on the ground rises Conrad, like a demonic anthill poised to blow over on the band of the Falcon. Once again, Conrad is the first to burst out laughing at Guts' valorous display of friendship because, as a God Hand, he knows what's coming next. Slan gives the soon-to-be former Falcons a breakdown of how this whole ascending to demonkind thing works. Once Griffith sacrifices his comrades, as a possessor of the Crimson Behelit, he will be reincarnated as a member of the God Hand, and he will do so of his own free will. When the band starts panicking and muttering amongst themselves, Void silences them all by proclaiming that all lies within the current of causality. The threads representing their lives have been spun into this very moment they call the eclipse, and it was now time for the invocation of doom. The Archangel of Demonkind takes a back seat in the proceedings for once, because the subject of this video is about to do something he never does: open his eyes. You can check every panel of Berserk individually, and we bet you won't find more than 2 panels of Conrad with open eyes in the entire series, and the only reason he did it now was to bring the child to the altar. Using his transmutation powers, Conrad uses the faces underneath Griffith's feet to erect a giant hand and begin his ascension ceremony. He joins Ubik when he gives Griffith an astral trip down memory lane and assists his fellow God Hand in convincing Griffith that his path towards his castle was laden with the corpses of thousands of dead men and that he always knew the cost. Once Griffith chants "I sacrifice" within his heart and fulfills the invocation of doom, Conrad watches the birth of Femto and his first act as a demonic angel, violating Casca. He also witnesses Skull Knight saving Guts and Casca from their fates for the time being, but remains unmoved because once again, he knows that this is all just the first step. Next comes the incarnation ceremony, and this is where Conrad truly shines as a demon. In chapter 126, we see the return of Sir Laban to the story, and it could not have come at a grimmer time for the Kingdom of Midland. The Kushan were invading their borders. The king had engaged 70% of the Midland army to finding a man who now resides in the astral world, and refugees were flooding every Midland territory not being besieged. And to make matters worse, a terrible plague has gripped all the land. Laban walked through that city where mounds of corpses littered the streets, and knew instinctively what had happened here. With this many rats feasting on the flesh of the dead, there was little wonder that the plague had spilled over to the entire kingdom. The old man Laban met put it best. These days, rats ruled the streets, not men, and as causality would have it, they were being driven by our very own Conrad. After Laban makes his exit, the rats all congregate in one spot, from which the face of Conrad manifests before letting out a gup and disappearing again. This was the first sign that the God Hand had meddled with the physical world to prepare the path for Griffith's incarnation. Conrad's unleashing of pestilence upon mankind is what drove many Midland refugees to the holy city of St. Albion, which was the site of the incarnation ceremony. His rats continued to do their dirty work, even within the refugee camps, as the blood blobs of malice began devouring every living thing in the Tower of Conviction's vicinity. Conrad was seen during the ceremony itself, when the 4 original God Hand members manifested as blobs of blood themselves. When the Tower of Conviction toppled due to the immense force being generated by the spirits of the dead, its ceiling crumbled to resemble the very hand upon which Femto was birthed. In the palm of this hand, Slan, Ubik, Void, and Conrad rose up to see the final moments of a world still tethered to reason, and were confronted by the Black Swordsman. Guts, in his rage, lashed out at the God Hand members, but quickly realized that they were simply manifestations and that none of them were actually there. After Femto's incarnation into the physical world is successfully completed, Conrad ends up in a part of the astral world that even his kinsmen don't know of. In chapter 220, Slan reveals that following the incarnation ceremony, the rest of her kin were scattered across the astral world to their preferred Sephira, where they lay floating, formless. But as she tells the Skull Knight before this revelation, this wasn't going to last for too long. That's because the incarnation ceremony marked the beginning of the end for the world of reason, and we learned what that means for the story the hard way when Femto took off Emperor Ganishka's head. If you want to know more about what happened there, check out our Emperor Ganishka Origins video, but long story short, Ganishka drew so much power from within the astral world in his Shiva form that a single slice from the Skull Knight's sword of actuation triggered a global interstice and brought the world back to a state of fantasia. In this state, Conrad finally manifests into the physical world as a sea of pestilence. His entire entire body is comprised of rats. He rises from the depths like a tidal wave that drowns anything that touches it, including those skeletons you're seeing in this panel. This is Conrad's first appearance in the manga so far, and it might be this way for a while, given the fact that Berserk is on hiatus again, but we can use the information given to us to put together a rough sketch of what this man might have looked like in his previous life. So without delaying any further, let's look into Conrad's possible origins. A healer of men or a bringer of plague? Who was Conrad in his previous life? If you've seen any of our videos on the God Hand or apostles in general, then you will have noticed a simple pattern emerge amongst all of them. Person gets Behelit, person falls into despair and activates said Behelit, person sacrifices the one thing that defines their humanity in exchange for immortal life as a demon, unless they're cleaved in half by a massive slab of raw iron, of course. This is more or less how it was for Conrad as well, except his case must have been far more intense given the fact that he is a God Hand, not an apostle. This also means that Conrad received a Crimson Behelit, not a regular one, and that he is, at the very least, 216 years old. Given the fact that he looks and acts like a plague bringer in the story, and the Berserk has a habit of tying in one person's current existence to their previous lives, we get a pretty good idea of what Conrad might have been as a human. The form of a God Hand member is reflective of their deepest desires and what they believe to be their true selves. This is why Griffith's form as Femto retains his iconic warhelm, but gives him raven black wings to allow him to finally reach the castle of his dreams. You already know our opinion on why Void looks the way he does. If you don't, then pause this video right now and go check out his origins video as well. But with the appropriate context given, let us now paint a picture of a man who was supposed to be a herald of life for the people, but ended up becoming a Grim Reaper instead. Conrad, like Griffith and Void, must have had a prominent role in society. We make this assumption simply because it has been made clear that to become a God Hand, a much larger sacrifice is needed than a single relative, and simply put, that does not come without being a leader of men. What we're saying is Conrad was a leader of men, but not of soldiers. Given the fact that he is so closely associated to Pestilence in Berserk, it is more likely that he was some kind of priest or doctor in his human life. We'll address the priest assumption first. Conrad, in most of his appearances, has his fists clasped with one another, the same as Ubik. Ubik was most definitely someone used to public speaking in his own human life, because that boy could sell you lead paint by calling it eco-friendly goo, and you'd still buy that stuff. But more than that, pestilence and plague were often thought of as a sign of God's wrath. There is a reason that many ancient civilizations believed large-scale pandemics and epidemics to be God-sent threats. It's because they did not yet have the means to counter it. Plagues were often seen as omens, and lacking effective forms of pest control, agents like rats and woodlice went on rampages unchecked. It's possible that Conrad, as a priest, preached the gospel of faith even in light of the terrors of a disease like the plague, but when he himself came down with it, his deep desire to survive and his life's blood mingling with his Crimson Behelit summoned the God Hand. Once there, the process of becoming a demon was explained to him, and he was asked to sacrifice that which defined his very humanity. In the case of this assumption, that would be Conrad's followers. Once he had fulfilled the purpose of the Invocation of Doom, Conrad was turned into a combination of a woodlouse, a Cenobite, and H.R. Giger's Landscape 8, and he rose up as a member of the God Hand. The second possibility is what intrigues us more, however, because if Conrad was a doctor, then his ascension takes on a decidedly darker turn. Imagine being a medical visionary at a time when most diseases weren't even understood, let alone taken seriously. Imagine traveling from town to town, healing the sick and afflicted with your wealth of knowledge, only to be accused of being a heretic or the like because of how he learned his skills. Imagine him finding a fervent following thanks to the people whose lives he had saved, and devoted opposition from the men he was making fools of. Imagine Conrad one day coming across a soothsayer and being curious about her esoteric occupation, deciding to take the crimson egg-shaped artifact she was shilling to him. Once you put these things together, you start to realize where we're going with this, and where Miura-san could have gone with this if he were still with us today. If there's such a thing as overachieving being the cause of your downfall, then we suspect Conrad to be its chief example, because at some point in his life, someone that he knew or had treated before ended up dying because of the plague, and it's quite possible that Conrad himself contracted it alongside them. This is because the painting that Miura based Conrad's appearance on, Giger's Landscape 8, is a painting depicting plague-ridden children. Now, what looks like a plague-ridden bedridden child clad in a leather woodlouse costume. If you're thinking what we're thinking, then we'll just move on to our next point. In the final moments of his death throes, the former medicine man starts bleeding from somewhere on his body. The blood seeps into his behelit, and his deep desire to survive the thing he had saved countless people from summons the God Hand. There, he is shown the truth of his nature, that he himself had a disease, that being his savior complex. Because he was so good at saving people, Conrad believed himself above them, and in the end was brought down by something he simply didn't know how to treat. But with their help, he could become the very thing that plagues so many people's lives across multiple generations. He could control who dies because of pestilence and when, and that appealed to him so much that he sacrificed all the people who verified his human existence for it. Reborn as a member of the God Hand, he has learned not to blab on about his wealth of knowledge, and instead reserves his speech for important events. Conrad now prefers to let his actions do the talking for him, as we have pointed out in the previous sections. As for when this could have happened, we would venture to guess right after Void's manifestation, because that is when the world would still have been suffering from the collapse of Geiseric's continental empire. You might think that 216 years is a long time for people to recover from the collapse of a single empire, but when that empire encompasses all of humanity, you can start to see why it makes sense. From the disease-ridden ashes of the Supreme King's empire rose a demonic woodlouse intent upon poisoning the rest of his legacy 1,000 years later, and so far, the woodlouse has not failed to deliver. Marvelous verdict. And that's it for this video. We called Conrad the quiet one in our video because he is, quite literally, the most reserved member of the God Hand. If we had to rank characters by the number of their speaking lines from this demonic quintumvirate, Conrad would rank dead last. But that's what makes him such an interesting character as well. His design is inherently unsettling, given that it's practically a child's face and hands on an insect's body, but his silence is what speaks volumes. He doesn't beat around the bush like Ubik, make his desires known like Slan, put people in their places like Femto, or even give long-winded speeches like Void. His speech is short, crisp, and to the point, which is what makes it harder to decipher where he came from. Hopefully we've done enough to at least get that conversation started, and we'd love to know what you think about Conrad's past life in the comments section below. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, be safe out there, and thanks for watching.